Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing stories ever to echo through the foggy streets. Comment where you're watching us from right now, because you're about to delve into something that will mess with your head until the very last second. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. It was 1891, and Pittsburgh was already breathing smoke and steel. The chimneys of the foundries stained the sky a permanent grey, and the city was growing at an alarming rate. Thousands of people arrived every month seeking work in the industries that never stopped. In this chaotic scenario where nobody really knew anybody, certain things could go unnoticed for too long. And that's exactly what happened. In the Allegheny district, north of the river that divided the city, there was a boarding house that catered to steelworkers. The place was on a narrow street, lined with brick buildings darkened by industrial soot. The owner was a middle-aged woman named Margaret Halstead, known for her low prices and no questions asked. This attracted a specific type of guest. Lonely men, newcomers with no family nearby, no one to ask about them. The boarding house had 3 floors and a deep basement, where Margaret said she stored provisions and coal for the harsh Pennsylvania winter. The rooms were cramped, the walls thin, and the smell of rancid grease permeated every corner. But it was shelter, and in Pittsburgh in 1891, that was a lot. The neighbors noticed strange things. Guests who would come in and never be seen leaving again. Margaret always had a ready explanation. They had moved to another city, gotten jobs at some distant foundry, or returned to their hometown. No one questioned it much. After all, workers were constantly coming and going in that bustling city. But there was something in Margaret's gaze that was unsettling, a calculated coldness, a smile that never reached her eyes. She was meticulous, organized, and kept detailed records of everyone who passed through her boarding house. Names, arrival dates, amounts paid, everything noted in a black-covered notebook that she kept locked in a drawer. What nobody knew was that Margaret had another notebook, one that she hid much better, and in that second notebook there were notes that told a completely different story. A dark, disturbing story that would only come to light when it was too late for many. The factories in Pittsburgh worked day and night. The noise was constant, deafening, hammering, controlled explosions, the hiss of steam escaping from the boilers. In a city like that, other sounds could easily be lost. Shouts could be mistaken for the screeching of machinery, and nobody paid much attention to what happened in the cheap boarding houses of the Allegheny district. Margaret had a method. She chose carefully. Single men with no apparent ties who paid in advance for weeks of lodging. She observed them, studied their habits, waited for the right moment. And when that moment arrived, the boarding house held yet another secret in the shadows of its basement. The winter of 1891 was particularly brutal. The snow began to fall in November and didn't stop until March. The streets became impassable, and people isolated themselves in their homes, battling the biting cold that came from the Allegheny Mountains. It was the perfect season for Margaret. Less movement, less curiosity, less risk. Back then, the Pittsburgh police were more concerned with worker strikes and conflicts between unions and employers. Missing men, that happened every day. Many died in factory accidents, others simply continued their journeys. Some fell drunk into the river and were swept away by the current. Nobody investigated much. Margaret knew this. She understood perfectly how the city functioned, how the authorities operated, where the loopholes in the system were, and she exploited each one of them with frightening precision. The boarding house had a strict routine: breakfast at 6, dinner at 7 in the evening. Margaret cooked everything herself, and the guests praised the hearty and flavorful food. She served large portions of stew, fresh bread, and strong coffee, food that warmed the body in the relentless Pennsylvania cold, food that could also conceal other ingredients, other purposes. There was a regular guest named Thomas Brennan, an Irishman who worked as a moulder at a nearby foundry. He had been living at the boarding house for months and began to notice inconsistencies. Rooms that suddenly became empty, belongings left behind, doors locked without explanation. Thomas wasn't one to meddle, but curiosity began to gnaw at him from the inside. One night he woke to a sound coming from downstairs. It was late, past midnight, and there shouldn't be any movement at that hour. Thomas went down the stairs carefully, avoiding the creaking steps. He saw light escaping from under the basement door, and he heard something else, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged. He waited, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, until Margaret came upstairs again. She locked the basement door with 2 different keys and went to her quarters on the 3rd floor. Thomas stood there, his heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. The next day he tried to casually chat with Margaret about the other guests. She responded with polite evasions, quickly changed the subject, and Thomas felt a chill run down his spine when she looked at him with those cold, calculating eyes. From that moment on, Thomas began sleeping with the door locked and a chair against the doorknob. He knew he had seen something he shouldn't have, and he knew Margaret knew it too. The story was only beginning to unfold, and the secrets of the Halstead boarding house still held revelations that would defy all logic, all sense of humanity. Pittsburgh, with all its smoke and progress, hid in the shadows something far darker than anyone could imagine. Thomas Brennan couldn't get that night out of his head. The following days were tense, heavy with an atmosphere that seemed to weigh on his shoulders. He continued going to the foundry every morning, returning in the late afternoon covered in soot, but now he observed everything with different eyes. The boarding house that had once been just a place to sleep had transformed into something unsettling. Margaret maintained her impeccable routine, always polite, always efficient, always with that smile that conveyed no warmth whatsoever. She served meals punctually, cleaned the rooms with obsessive dedication, and treated her guests with a courtesy that bordered on artificial. Thomas now noticed details he had previously ignored. The way she studied each person at the table, how her eyes lingered a second longer on certain faces, how she jotted things down in that black notebook she always carried with her. The snow continued to fall on Pittsburgh, covering the streets with a white blanket that soon turned to grey mud from the constant soot of the chimneys. The Allegheny River flowed slow and dark, its icy waters reflecting the perpetually cloudy sky. It was easy to feel isolated in that city, even surrounded by thousands of people. A new guest arrived one afternoon in February. His name was Vincent Ashford, a distinguished-looking man who claimed to be from somewhere in the South. He had refined manners, neat clothes, and spoke with a drawling accent that contrasted sharply with the roughness of the local workers. Vincent was looking for investment opportunities in Pittsburgh's burgeoning industries, or at least that's what he told anyone who would listen. Margaret treated Vincent with special attention. She offered him the best room in the guest house on the 2nd floor, overlooking the main street. She prepared more elaborate meals, brought imported tea, and showed a hospitality that the other guests rarely received. Thomas watched all this with growing unease. Vincent was cordial with everyone. He chatted during dinner, asked questions about the city, and showed genuine interest in the workers' stories. He had an easy laugh and a way of making people feel important. Thomas wanted to warn him, wanted to say something, but how could he explain a premonition? How could he talk about sounds in the night and locked doors without sounding paranoid? Weeks passed, and Vincent settled comfortably into the boarding house. He would go out during the day for meetings he claimed to have with investors and factory owners, returning at nightfall with stories about the city's meteoric growth. Margaret listened to everything with genuine interest, or perhaps it was just another of his calculated performances. Thomas began conducting his own discreet investigations. He spoke with other workers, asking about men who had disappeared in recent months. The answers were always vague. So-and-so went back to Ireland, so-and-so got a job in Cleveland, so-and-so moved west in search of better opportunities. Nothing that raised suspicions, nothing that could be proven or disputed. But there was a pattern. All the men mentioned had one thing in common. They had stayed at Margaret Halstead's boarding house at some point, and none of them had left a contact address or sent any news after leaving. One night, Thomas decided to take a risk. He waited until he was sure Margaret was in her 3rd-floor rooms, and then went down to the basement door. The 2 locks were complex, impossible to open without the correct keys. He pressed his ear to the thick wood, trying to pick up any sound coming from below. There was only silence, a dense and oppressive silence that seemed to have its own weight. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. He turned quickly and found Margaret standing in the hallway, holding a lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. She said nothing, only observed him with that impenetrable expression. Thomas mumbled some excuse about hearing a noise and thinking it might be rats. Margaret simply nodded slowly and waited for him to go back upstairs to his room. That night, Thomas didn't sleep a wink. Every creak of the old house made him jump. Every breath of wind against the window sounded like a warning. He knew he had crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back. Vincent Ashford, for his part, seemed oblivious to any tension. He continued his daily activities, always cheerful, always confident. Margaret intensified her attention towards him. And Thomas noticed how she studied him during meals, how she jotted things down in her notebook after Vincent went up to his room. Pittsburgh continued its relentless march toward modernization. New factories opened every month, more workers arrived on crowded trains, and the city expanded in every direction. In this whirlwind of progress and ambition, it was easy for certain things to go unnoticed. It was easy for people to disappear without a trace. Thomas began making plans to leave the boarding house. He looked for other places to live, but the prices were prohibitive and vacancies scarce. He was stuck there, at least for now, sharing the same roof with Margaret and her impenetrable secrets. Winter finally began to recede. March brought the first signs of thawing, and the dirty snow on the streets began to melt, revealing the debris accumulated during months of intense cold. The entire city seemed to awaken from a frozen nightmare, but for Thomas, the real nightmare was only beginning to take shape. Vincent mentioned during dinner that he planned to stay a few more weeks. He had found promising opportunities and wanted to explore them before making any final decisions. Margaret smiled sweetly and said he could stay as long as he liked. Thomas felt a knot in his stomach. That night, he made a decision. He needed to find out what was in the basement. He needed to confirm or dispel his suspicions. He couldn't continue living in that state of constant anxiety, always looking over his shoulder, always expecting something terrible to happen. But how could he do that without being discovered? How could he enter a locked basement with 2 different locks, in a house where Margaret always seemed attentive, always vigilant? Thomas knew he would need to be smarter, more careful. A mistake could cost him dearly, very dearly. The Halstead boarding house kept its secrets well protected, hidden behind locked doors and cold smiles. And while Pittsburgh grew and prospered under its blanket of industrial smoke, something far more sinister simmered in the shadows of that blackened brick building in the Allegheny district. The opportunity arose unexpectedly. Margaret announced during breakfast that she would need to be away for the entire day. She had matters to attend to in another part of the city, issues related to properties and documents that required her personal presence. She would leave right after breakfast and return only the following morning. The guests would have to fend for themselves with their meals, but there was bread, cold cuts, and canned goods in the pantry. Thomas could barely conceal his reaction. It was the chance he'd been waiting for, perhaps the only one he'd ever have. But there was a problem. Margaret would surely have the keys to the basement. He would need to find another way in. Vincent seemed enthusiastic about the prospect of having the guest house practically to himself. He suggested that the guests have dinner together, that they share a communal meal while the owner was away. The others agreed enthusiastically, happy for the break from the rigid routine that Margaret imposed. As soon as she left, taking with her a small suitcase and her ever-present black notebook, Thomas began planning his next steps. He had worked briefly as a blacksmith's apprentice before moving into the foundries, and knew a few things about locks and mechanisms. He wasn't an expert, but perhaps it was enough. The day passed with a torturous slowness. Thomas went to the foundry as usual, worked his normal hours, but his mind was elsewhere. He returned earlier than usual, claiming not to feel well. The other guests were busy with their own business, and the guest house had that strange quiet that only happens when someone's dominant presence is absent. As night fell, Vincent organized the promised dinner. He had bought wine from a nearby tavern and prepared a lavish meal with what he found in the pantry. The men ate, drank, and conversed with a lightness that was uncommon in that place. For a few hours, the Halstead guest house seemed almost normal, almost welcoming. Thomas participated in the gathering, but drank little and ate even less. He waited for the night to pass, for the others to go up to their rooms, for silence to once again dominate the hallways. And finally, around midnight, the house fell asleep. He descended the stairs with the care of a thief, each step measured and silent. He carried with him some improvised tools, thin wires, a small hammer wrapped in cloth, a candle to light his work. His heart was beating so hard, he was sure the sound would echo throughout the entire house. The basement door stood there, solid and intimidating in the dim light of the hallway. Thomas knelt before it and began working on the first lock. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to remain calm. The lock was old, simpler than it looked. After several minutes of careful attempts, he heard the satisfying click that indicated success. The second lock proved more challenging. It was a more modern, more complex mechanism. Thomas worked patiently, adjusting the wires, feeling the internal resistance, trying to understand how the pieces fit together. Sweat dripped down his forehead despite the cold in the hallway. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but was only perhaps 40 minutes, the second lock gave way. Thomas stood still for a moment, his hand on the doorknob, gathering courage for what he might find on the other side. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by his own heavy breathing. He opened the door slowly. A strange odor rose from the basement, a mixture of mold, damp earth, and something else he couldn't identify. The darkness down there was complete, thick as black velvet. Thomas lit his candle and began to descend the wooden steps that creaked under his weight. The cellar was larger than he had imagined. It stretched the entire length of the boarding house, divided into several sections by brick walls and supporting pillars. There were stacked crates, barrels of provisions, sacks of coal, shelves with preserves, everything very organized, very tidy, excessively tidy, in fact. Thomas walked between the sections, the candlelight casting grotesque shadows on the damp walls. There was an area at the back that seemed different from the others. The floor there was of packed earth, while the rest of the cellar was paved with uneven stones. And the earth seemed to have been recently disturbed. There were subtle variations in color and texture. He approached the area with a mixture of fascination and horror. Something there was wrong, fundamentally wrong. He could feel it in every fiber of his being, but before he could examine it more closely, he heard a sound that chilled his blood, the front door of the boarding house opening. Margaret had returned. Thomas blew out the candle in one swift motion, plunging the basement into total darkness. He heard footsteps above, the distinctive sound of Margaret's boots against the wooden floor. She was moving through the house, checking rooms, and then the footsteps stopped. They stopped right above the basement door. He held his breath, pressing himself against the cold wall. The seconds dragged on like hours. Then he heard the sound of footsteps descending the hall stairs, drawing ever closer. A light began to appear from the top of the basement stairs. Margaret was coming down, carrying a lamp. Thomas desperately searched for a hiding place. There was a narrow space behind a pile of crates, and he squeezed himself in, making himself as small as possible. The light from Margaret's lamp grew, gradually illuminating the basement. He could see her shadow projected on the wall, distorted and menacing. Margaret reached the foot of the stairs and stopped. She stood there for a long moment, just watching, as if she could sense that something was different, that someone had invaded her secret domain. Thomas didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move an inch. Finally, she walked to the back area, to that hard-packed earthen floor that had caught Thomas's attention. She knelt there, placed the lamp on the ground beside her, and began to scan the surface with her hands, as if searching for signs of disturbance. Satisfied with what she found or didn't find, Margaret stood up and walked to a distant shelf. She took something from there, something Thomas couldn't see clearly from his hiding place, and then returned to the stairs. Her steps climbed slowly, the light dimmed, and finally the basement door closed again. Thomas waited another 15 minutes before daring to move. When he finally emerged from behind the crates, his legs barely supported him. He climbed the stairs in the dark, opened the door with infinite care, and stepped out into the hallway. By some miracle, he managed to reach his room unseen. Lying in bed, trembling with fear and adrenaline, Thomas was trying to process what he had seen, or rather what he hadn't seen, because the real question was, what exactly was Margaret protecting down there, and what was buried in that dirt at the back of the basement? He knew he would need to go back there. He would need to uncover the truth, no matter the cost, because now he was absolutely certain the Halstead boarding house hid something terrible, something that Margaret Halstead guarded with obsessive zeal, and this discovery would change everything. The following days were filled with almost unbearable tension. Thomas woke up every day expecting Margaret to confront him, that she would somehow find out about his nighttime intrusion into the basement, but she continued her routine as always, unperturbed and methodical. Perhaps she hadn't noticed anything, or perhaps she was just waiting for the right moment to act. Vincent Ashford seemed to be increasingly integrated into boarding house life. He had extended his stay indefinitely, claiming to have found promising business opportunities in Pittsburgh. Margaret showed a peculiar interest in his plans, asking detailed questions during dinners, jotting down information in her notebook with that obsessive dedication that characterized her. Thomas watched these interactions with growing apprehension. He saw a pattern forming, saw Margaret weaving her web around Vincent with the patience of an experienced spider, and Vincent, confident and carefree, walked straight into the center of that web, unaware of the danger. March gave way to April, and Pittsburgh began to awaken from its winter lethargy. The trees in the city's few green spaces timidly sprouted, battling the constant soot that covered everything. The Allegheny River flowed faster with the thaw in the mountains, its murky waters carrying the residue of months of industrial activity. Thomas made a decision. He couldn't go to the authorities without concrete proof. Suspicions and hunches wouldn't be enough to convince anyone to investigate a respectable citizen who had run a pension for years without any known incidents. He needed evidence, and that evidence was in the basement. But how to get back there? Margaret hadn't been absent since that night, and she seemed even more vigilant, like an animal sensing a predator nearby. Thomas needed a different plan, something that would guarantee enough time for a proper investigation. The solution came unexpectedly. One of the longest-serving guests, a taciturn man named Ernst, who worked as a stevedore on the river docks, mentioned during dinner that his sister was ill in Harrisburg. He would need to travel there at the end of the week and would be away for a few days. Margaret assured him that his room would be waiting for him when he returned. Thomas saw this as an opportunity. If he could create a situation that required Margaret's absence, even for just a few hours, he would have the necessary time. But how could he do this without arousing suspicion? The answer came when he overheard Margaret talking to the butcher who delivered meat to the boarding house. She mentioned having properties in other parts of town, investments that required his occasional attention. Thomas memorized these details, formulating a risky but potentially effective plan. He sent Margaret an anonymous message, claiming to be from a lawyer who handled property matters. The message requested her urgent presence at a downtown office to resolve contractual issues that couldn't wait. Thomas took care to make the message seem legitimate, using appropriate legal terms and a real address of an office he knew existed. To their surprise and relief, the plan worked. Margaret announced that she would need to leave the following morning to attend to important matters. She would leave early and probably wouldn't return before nightfall. The guests would have to fend for themselves once again. Thomas barely slept that night. He mentally reviewed every step he needed to take, every move he had to make. This time, there would be no room for error. This time, he would uncover the truth, no matter what he found. Margaret left shortly after dawn, carrying her suitcase and documents. Thomas waited until he was sure she was far enough away, then claimed to be feeling unwell and told the other guests he would stay at the guest house to rest. Vincent offered help, but Thomas politely declined, saying he only needed rest. As soon as the guest house was empty with all the guests at work, Thomas acted quickly. He had stored his makeshift tools in a safe place, and now he retrieved them with determined hands. The locks on the basement door gave way more easily this time. His hands already knew the mechanisms. He descended the steps with a lit lamp, illuminating the wide space that stretched beneath the boarding house. This time I had time. He could investigate properly, examine every corner, search for evidence of whatever Margaret was hiding. Thomas went straight to the back area, where the ground was packed earth. He had brought a small shovel hidden under his coat, and now he began to carefully dig in that area, which seemed to have been recently disturbed. The earth was compact but damp, making the work a little easier. He dug for several minutes, creating a hole of moderate depth, and then his shovel struck something that wasn't dirt, something solid, but which yielded slightly under the impact. Thomas felt his heart race. With trembling hands, he removed the dirt around the object, gradually clearing it away. It was a wooden chest, old, reinforced with metal at the edges, with a simple lock that already showed signs of rust. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his hand on the lid, knowing that what he was about to discover would change everything. Then, with a decisive movement, he forced the lock with one of his tools. The trunk lid opened with a mournful creak. Inside were personal belongings: leather wallets, pocket watches, chains, rings, documents yellowed with age, all items that clearly belonged to different owners, each telling the silent story of someone who had stayed at the boarding house. And alongside these objects was another notebook, similar to the one Margaret always carried, but this one was stained and had loose pages. Thomas picked up the notebook with trembling hands and began to read by the lamplight. What he found there chilled his blood. They were detailed records, meticulous notes about guests, their routines, their belongings, their vulnerabilities. And next to some names, there were peculiar marks, symbols that Thomas couldn't decipher, but that emanated a sense of sinister purpose. He counted quickly. There were personal items belonging to at least 12 different people in that trunk. 12 men who had stayed at Margaret Halstead's boarding house, and whose belongings now lay buried in the basement, like macabre trophies of something terrible. Thomas felt nausea rise in his throat. He had found his proof, but the weight of this discovery was overwhelming. What exactly had happened to those men? And more importantly, where were they now? He continued examining the basement, now with a renewed sense of urgency. There were other areas where the earth seemed to have been disturbed, other sections that looked suspicious. But he had neither the time nor the courage to dig any further. What he had found was already enough, already too horrific. Thomas carefully put everything back as it was, covered the chest with earth again, and tried to leave the area exactly as he found it. He couldn't let Margaret know that his secret had been discovered. Not yet. Not until he decided what to do with that devastating information. He staggered up the stairs, locked the basement door, and returned to his room. He hid the stained notebook under the mattress, tangible evidence of what he had discovered. His mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. I needed to warn Vincent. The man was in danger, as were all the other guests. But how could I do that without causing panic? How could I explain what I knew without revealing that I had broken into the basement? And there was another, more pressing matter. Margaret would be back in a few hours, and when she returned, Thomas would have to act as if nothing had happened, as if he didn't now carry the terrible weight of knowing the truth about the Halstead boarding house and the secrets it kept beneath its creaking wooden floors. Margaret returned at dusk, as promised. Her expression was unreadable as she entered through the front door, but Thomas noticed something different in her eyes. There was an intensity there, a spark of something that could be anger or suspicion. She greeted the guests with her usual politeness, but her gaze lingered on Thomas for a second longer than necessary. Dinner was served promptly at 7 o'clock. Margaret had prepared a hearty stew that exuded aromas of herbs and slow-cooked meat. The guests ate with appetite, Vincent particularly praising the seasoning. Thomas barely touched his food, pushing chunks of potato across his plate while watching Margaret move around the kitchen with her characteristic efficiency. She seemed to be watching everyone more closely that night. Her eyes scanned the table, studying every face, every reaction. Thomas felt like a mouse under the gaze of a cat, knowing that any wrong move could trigger something irreversible. After dinner, Vincent suggested they play cards in the common room. It was a rare activity at the boarding house, where usually everyone retired to their rooms right after meals. But Vincent had a way of livening things up, of making people relax. Some guests accepted the invitation, and soon an improvised poker table was formed. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway, drying dishes with a linen cloth. Thomas could feel the weight of her gaze, even when he wasn't looking directly at her. It was as if she had developed a sixth sense, an ability to perceive when something was out of place in her carefully controlled domain. Thomas went up to his room early, claiming to be tired. He locked the door and went straight to check if the stained notebook was still hidden under the mattress. It was there, its yellowed pages holding terrible secrets. He needed to decide quickly what to do with this incriminating evidence. His conscience wouldn't allow him to simply run away and leave the others behind. Vincent was in danger, as were all those who remained under that roof. Something needed to be done, and quickly, before Margaret fully realized how much he knew. The night wore on slowly. Thomas stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the guest house quieting down. The guests went up to their rooms one by one, their heavy steps on the wooden stairs. Vincent was the last, his laughter still echoing faintly as he passed through the hallway, and then silence descended upon the house like a shroud. Thomas waited until midnight, then dressed completely, and retrieved the stained notebook from under the mattress. He had decided to go to the nearest police station, hand over the evidence, and tell them everything he knew. He would let the authorities deal with Margaret and properly investigate the basement. He opened his bedroom door with infinite care and began to descend the stairs, avoiding the creaking steps. The hallway was bathed in twilight, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. Thomas reached the entrance hall and already had his hand on the doorknob of the main door when he sensed a presence behind him. Margaret stood in the middle of the hallway, a lamp in her hand, wearing a dark robe that made her look like an apparition emerging from the shadows. How had she appeared there without making a sound? How long had she been watching? Thomas tried to make up an excuse about insomnia and needing fresh air, but the words came out weak and unconvincing. Margaret simply watched him with that disturbing intensity, her eyes reflecting the flame of the lamp like burning embers. She mentioned something about the dangers of the streets after midnight, about how all sorts of threats lurked in the darkness. The way she said it, the tone of her voice, carried a veiled message that couldn't be ignored. Thomas felt the notebook press against his ribs, hidden under his coat. If she found out what he was carrying, there was no doubt about what would happen. He stepped back, agreeing that perhaps it would be better to return to the room. Margaret was partially blocking the path to the stairs, and when she finally moved aside to let him pass, she casually mentioned that he should avoid the basement at night. The stairs were old and dangerous in the dark, and she wouldn't want him to have an accident. The threat was crystal clear, even wrapped in words of feigned concern. Thomas climbed the stairs, his legs trembling. Margaret knew. Perhaps she didn't know exactly what he had discovered, but she knew he was going where he shouldn't, and that warning about accidents wasn't accidental. Back in his room, he locked the door and pushed the chair against it again. He needed a new plan. He looked out the window. It was a considerable drop to the street, but there was a narrow cornice running along the second floor. Perhaps he could use it to reach the window of the next room, which belonged to Ernst, the stevedore who had traveled to Harrisburg. From there he could descend by a different route, but before any escape he needed to warn Vincent. Margaret had mentioned during dinner that she would like to have a private conversation with him the following evening, a special dinner to discuss their investment opportunities. Thomas had seen that same pattern described in the stained notebook. Special dinners alone with Margaret were the prelude to something terrible. The following morning, Thomas pretended to follow his normal routine. He went to the foundry, worked a few hours, but left early claiming to be feeling ill. In reality, he went straight to look for Vincent in the places he knew the man usually frequented during the day. He found him in a cafe near the business district, reading a newspaper and drinking tea. Thomas sat down at his table and began to recount everything in a low but urgent voice. The basement door, the buried trunk, the belongings of missing men, the notebook with his sinister notes. He saw Vincent's expression change from skepticism to concern, and finally to something close to horror. 12 people had stayed at that boarding house and were never seen again. Their belongings were buried in the basement. The conclusions were inevitable and terrifying. Vincent processed the information in silence, clearly shaken by the revelation. Thomas had a plan. Margaret was watching him closely, but Vincent still had her trust. That trust could be the key to exposing her definitively. The dinner scheduled for the following night would be the perfect opportunity, but Vincent would need to be extremely cautious. He shouldn't eat or drink anything without seeing Margaret taste it first, and Thomas would be nearby, hidden, ready to intervene if necessary. It was risky, even dangerous, but Thomas saw no other option. They needed a way to catch Margaret red-handed, to have concrete evidence that the authorities couldn't ignore, and that special dinner could be exactly the decisive moment. Vincent agreed to the plan, though his expression revealed understandable apprehension. They spent the next hour discussing every detail, preparing for what could be the final confrontation with the secrets of the Halstead boarding house. Thomas returned to the boarding house in the late afternoon, maintaining a facade of normalcy. Margaret greeted him with her usual politeness, but he sensed the underlying tension in her every gesture. It was as if they were both participating in a macabre dance, each knowing that the other knew, but neither openly admitting it. Night arrived with agonizing slowness. Thomas dined with the other guests, forcing himself to eat and converse normally. Margaret announced that the following day she would serve a special dinner for Mr. Ashford, and that the other guests should get ready on their own that evening. The news was received without much reaction from the others, but Thomas and Vincent exchanged a meaningful glance. That night, lying in his bed, Thomas mentally reviewed the plan. Everything depended on perfect timing and the courage to act at the right moment. He would hide the stained notebook in a safe place outside the boarding house before dinner, ensuring that the evidence wouldn't be lost if something went wrong. The next day dawned with a sky heavy with dense clouds that promised a storm. Pittsburgh was shrouded in that characteristic gloom that turned midday into perpetual twilight. Thomas went to the foundry, but could barely concentrate on his work. His mind was completely focused on what would happen that night. Upon returning to the boarding house in the late afternoon, he executed the first part of his plan. He hid the stained notebook in a safe place nearby, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Then, he went back to his room and began to mentally prepare himself for what was to come. Margaret was in the kitchen, preparing the special dinner with obsessive care. The aromas emanating from it were tempting, and Thomas felt a chill at the thought of what that food might contain beyond the visible ingredients. She had set an elegant table in the private dining room with a linen tablecloth, candles and even flowers in a delicate vase. Vincent came down promptly at 8 o'clock, formally dressed for the occasion. Margaret greeted him with a warm smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thomas observed everything from his hiding place in the dark second-floor hallway, from where he had a partial view of the dining room through a crack in the staircase. Dinner began with all appearances of normality. Margaret served the dishes elegantly. Vincent thanked everyone with his characteristic cordiality. Thomas watched everything, tense as a violin string about to break, waiting for the moment when he would need to act. Dinner proceeded with agonizing slowness. Margaret served each dish with careful, almost ritualistic movements, while Vincent kept the conversation flowing with comments about his impressions of Pittsburgh and the opportunities the city offered. Thomas observed from his post in the dark hallway every tense muscle, every heightened sense. Vincent followed the agreed-upon instructions. He expected Margaret to taste each dish before taking a single bite. She seemed oblivious to this caution, or perhaps simply didn't care. She drank the same wine he served, ate from the same platter he offered. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly innocent. But Thomas knew better. He had seen what was buried in the basement. He had read the notes in the stained notebook. Margaret was patient, meticulous, and would not make obvious mistakes. Whatever she planned would be executed with the same surgical precision that characterized everything she did. The conversation during dinner revolved around business and investments. Margaret demonstrated surprising knowledge about Pittsburgh's industries, about which factories were thriving and which were facing difficulties. Vincent seemed impressed, asking detailed questions, taking mental notes. It was an elaborate dance, each playing their part perfectly. Thomas noticed when Margaret got up to get dessert from the kitchen. She disappeared for a few minutes, and Vincent took the opportunity to discreetly look in the direction where he knew Thomas was hiding. An almost imperceptible nod confirmed that everything was fine up to that point. Margaret returned with an apple pie that exuded cinnamon and caramelized sugar. She cut 2 generous slices and served one to Vincent, the other to herself. She ate calmly, savoring each bite, while Vincent did the same after seeing her taste it first. The night wore on, and nothing extraordinary happened. Thomas was beginning to wonder if he had misinterpreted the signs, if perhaps his suspicions were exaggerated, the product of an imagination inflamed by fear. But then Margaret suggested they have a digestive in the living room, where there was a lit fireplace to ward off the damp cold that seeped through the old walls of the boarding house. Vincent politely agreed, and they both moved into the adjacent room. Thomas adjusted his position to keep a view of what was happening, gliding silently down the dark hallway. The fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that was both cozy and unsettling. Margaret poured liqueur into 2 crystal glasses, small doses of an amber liquid that shimmered in the firelight. She raised her glass in a toast to future opportunities, and Vincent did the same. But Thomas noticed something crucial. Margaret merely touched her lips to the glass, pretending to drink, while watching Vincent with the watchful eye of a predator. Vincent, however, was also paying attention. He mimicked her gesture, pretending to drink but actually just wetting his lips. Their acting was flawless, each trying to deceive the other, each believing they were succeeding. Margaret began talking about the guest house basement, about how she planned to renovate it, to make it more functional. He casually mentioned that he had stored various things there over the years, souvenirs from former guests, objects they had left behind when they departed abruptly. His voice was casual, but there was something calculated in the way he chose each word. Vincent asked if he could see the basement, showing interest in the building's structure. Margaret smiled that cold smile and agreed, saying it would be a pleasure to show him. She stood up, picked up a lamp, and walked toward the door leading to the basement. Thomas felt his heart race. This was the moment. If Vincent went down those stairs alone with Margaret, he might never climb them again. He needed to act, but he still had no concrete evidence of any crime. Margaret had done nothing more than offer hospitality, dinner, and polite conversation. Vincent followed Margaret to the basement door, keeping a safe distance. She took the 2 keys from a pocket in her dress and began to unlock the locks, one after the other. The metallic sound echoed in the silence of the sleeping house. The door opened, revealing the dense darkness that stretched below. Margaret began to descend the steps, the lamplight creating flickering circles of brightness. Vincent hesitated at the top of the stairs, and Thomas could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand clenched involuntarily. Then something unexpected happened. Ernst, the longshoreman who was supposed to be in Harrisburg visiting his sick sister, appeared at the front door. He had returned earlier than planned, and his sudden arrival broke the tension of the moment, like thunder breaking the silence. Margaret quickly climbed up from the cellar, slamming the door shut behind her with brusque movements. that betrayed barely concealed irritation. She greeted Ernst coldly, asking about his trip. He explained that his sister was better than he had expected, and that he had decided to return earlier. The interruption had saved Vincent, at least temporarily. The moment had passed, Margaret's opportunity thwarted. She quickly composed herself, resuming her mask of cordial hospitality, but Thomas could see the frustration in her eyes, the way her fingers clenched slightly as she closed the basement locks again. Vincent took advantage of the confusion to say goodbye, thanking them for the wonderful dinner and claiming he needed to rest for an important appointment the following morning. Margaret didn't insist, merely watching as he went upstairs to his room. Thomas returned to his own room before being discovered, his heart still racing with the tension of what he had witnessed. The plan hadn't worked exactly as expected, but it hadn't resulted in disaster either. Vincent was safe, at least for that night. The following morning, the boarding house awoke shrouded in a dense fog that transformed everything into ghostly shapes. Thomas met Vincent at breakfast, and they exchanged meaningful glances. They both knew they had come dangerously close to something terrible, but they still lacked the definitive proof they needed. Margaret was particularly quiet that morning. She served the coffee and bread with mechanical movements, her face an impenetrable mask. Thomas noticed that she looked at Ernst with something that could be resentment, as if she blamed his unexpected return for the frustration of her plans. During the day, while working at the foundry, Thomas formulated a new plan. Ernst's unexpected arrival had shown something important. Margaret was vulnerable to interruptions, to elements she couldn't control or predict. If they could create another similar situation, perhaps they could expose her definitively. But before he could act, something happened that would change everything. Upon returning to the boarding house in the late afternoon, Thomas found unusual activity in front of the building. Two men of official appearance were talking to Margaret at the entrance, and from her body language, it was clear that the conversation was not pleasant. Thomas approached discreetly, trying to overhear fragments of the conversation. The men were municipal investigators, asking questions about previous guests, about lodging records, about certain inconsistencies that had been noted in the city's official documents. Margaret replied with her characteristic politeness, but Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the doorframe. She claimed that all her records were in order, that she had complete documentation for every guest who had stayed at her boarding house. The investigators didn't seem entirely satisfied with the answers, but they also lacked the authority to conduct a search without a proper warrant. They said goodbye with a promise to return soon with more questions, leaving Margaret standing in the doorway, watching them drive away down the foggy street. Thomas went up to his room quickly, his brain working at full speed. Someone else had raised suspicions about the boarding house, perhaps relatives of missing guests, perhaps some acquaintance who had noticed the lack of news. It didn't matter who had started the investigation. What mattered was that there was now official pressure on Margaret, and a pressured Margaret was even more dangerous than a confident Margaret. Thomas knew she would go into protective mode, that she would try to eliminate any evidence, perhaps even any witness who could compromise her. He and Vincent were at the top of that list. That night, none of the guests dined at the boarding house. Margaret announced that she wasn't feeling well and that everyone should make their own way. It was an unprecedented break from the strict routine she had always maintained, and Thomas knew it meant something important. She was planning, reorganizing, preparing for what was to come. Thomas locked himself in his room and began packing discreetly. I needed to get out of there, and fast. But before leaving, he had one last thing to do: retrieve the stained notebook from its hiding place and ensure it reached the right hands. That notebook was the evidence that could finally expose Margaret Halstead and the terrible secrets she kept hidden beneath the floorboards of the boarding house. Night fell over Pittsburgh like a heavy cloak, bringing with it a fine, persistent rain that turned the streets into rivers of dark mud. Thomas waited until he was sure the boarding house was quiet before executing his plan. Margaret's absence at dinner was a clear sign that something was about to happen, and he didn't intend to be there when it did. He descended the stairs with extreme caution, each step an eternity of tension. The house seemed different that night, as if the walls themselves knew that a final confrontation was approaching. The shadows seemed denser, the creaks of old wood sounded louder, and the silence had an oppressive quality that made the air feel heavier. Thomas reached the entrance hall without incident. The front door was unlocked, an odd detail considering how obsessive Margaret was about security. He hesitated, his hand on the doorknob, wondering if this was a trap, but he had no choice. He needed to get out of there and retrieve the stained notebook before Margaret discovered its absence and possibly destroyed it. The street was deserted when he went out. The rain fell in diagonal curtains, driven by an icy wind coming from the river. Thomas pulled his hat over his eyes and began to walk quickly towards the place where he had hidden the notebook. It was a small niche at the back of an abandoned workshop, 3 blocks from the boarding house. The streets of Pittsburgh at that hour were a labyrinth of shadows and dangers. Night workers dragged themselves to their shifts in the foundries. Drunks staggered from tavern to tavern, and occasionally suspicious figures watched from dark alleyways. Thomas kept his head down, moving purposefully but without drawing attention. He reached the abandoned workshop and located the niche where he had hidden the notebook. His fingers found the oilcloth, damp from the rain that seeped through the cracks in the old boards. The notebook was there, intact and dry inside its protective covering. Thomas tucked it into his coat, close to his heart, and began to return along the same route. That's when he noticed something strange. A figure was following behind him, keeping a distance but clearly keeping up with him. Thomas quickened his pace, turning at random corners, testing whether he was actually being followed or if it was just paranoia. The figure remained there, persistent like a shadow. He changed direction, moving away from the inn and heading towards a busier area near the river docks. There would be more people there, more witnesses, less chance of something happening unnoticed. But when he looked back again, the figure had disappeared, swallowed by the fog and rain. Thomas stopped under the awning of a warehouse, trying to catch his breath and decide his next steps. He couldn't go back to the boarding house now, not with the notebook in his possession. He needed to find the authorities, hand over the evidence, tell them everything he knew. But the investigators' visit earlier that day suggested that perhaps there was already an investigation underway. The question was, how long would it take for this investigation to become official enough to protect the remaining guests of the boarding house? Vincent was still there, as were Ernst and 2 other workers who lived in the rooms on the 3rd floor, all of them potentially in danger, while Margaret felt trapped. Thomas made a decision. He would go directly to the Pittsburgh police headquarters, located in the business district. Even if it was late at night, there was always someone on duty. He would hand over the notebook, tell his story, and let them do what was necessary. The walk to the commercial district took almost an hour in the incessant rain. When he finally reached the brick building where the police station was located, he was soaked and shivering with cold. Inside, a sleepy officer attended to people at a counter, lit by gas lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls. Thomas introduced himself and began to tell his story, placing the stained notebook on the counter as physical evidence of his claims. The officer listened with growing skepticism, making occasional notes, but clearly unimpressed. It was a fantastic story after all. A respectable boarding house owner, operating for years without known incident, being accused of terrible acts based on belongings found in a basement and notes in an old notebook. But Thomas insisted. He mentioned the visit from the municipal investigators earlier that day, suggesting that there were already official suspicions about Margaret Halstead. The officer seemed more interested upon hearing this and disappeared for a few minutes to consult records in another room. When he returned, his attitude had changed. Apparently, there was indeed an ongoing investigation into suspicious disappearances in the Allegheny district area. Several families had reported losing contact with relatives staying in cheap guest houses, and a pattern was beginning to emerge. The Halstead guest house appeared in several of these reports. The officer called a superior, who in turn called 2 other investigators. Soon Thomas was surrounded by men asking detailed questions, examining the stained notebook, taking extensive notes. He recounted everything, from his initial suspicions to the discovery of the chest buried in the basement, including the tense dinner between Margaret and Vincent the previous night. The investigators decided to act immediately. An operation would be mounted for dawn, when they would conduct a thorough search of the Halstead boarding house. They would have appropriate warrants, excavate the basement, examine all the records, and Margaret would be detained for questioning while the investigation took place. Thomas felt immense relief upon hearing this, but also renewed worry. Dawn was hours away. Much could happen in that time. Margaret was intelligent, observant, and had certainly noticed his absence. If she suspected he had gone to the authorities, she might act desperately. One of the investigators offered to escort him back to the guest house, guaranteeing his safety while discreetly monitoring the premises until the official operation began at dawn. Thomas gratefully accepted, and together they went out into the rain. which was finally beginning to subside. The drive back was tense. The investigator, a stern-looking man named Morrison with economical movements, occasionally asked questions about the layout of the rooms in the boarding house, how many people would be there, and possible escape routes. Thomas answered with as much detail as he could muster, his mind still processing everything that had happened in the last few hours. As they approached the boarding house, everything seemed normal. The windows were dark, except for a faint light on the third floor, probably from Margaret's room. Morrison positioned himself where he could observe the main entrances without being seen, and instructed Thomas to enter normally, lock himself in his room, and not come out until the official operation began in the morning. Thomas agreed and climbed the front steps, with strides that seemed absurdly loud in the silence of the night. The door was still unlocked. He went inside, closed it gently behind him, and began to climb the stairs to his room. That's when he saw the light under the basement door. Someone was down there. And from the muffled sounds coming through the thick wooden door, that person was digging, moving earth, doing something that required considerable physical effort. Thomas froze halfway up the stairs, torn between curiosity and the instinct for self-preservation. Should he investigate? Should he call Morrison, or should he simply follow the instructions and lock himself in his room until dawn? The decision was taken from his hands when the basement door burst open. Margaret stood there covered in dirt, her hair disheveled, her eyes filled with a wild intensity he had never seen before. She held a shovel in one hand, and when her eyes met Thomas's, frozen there on the stairs, something passed between them, a mutual recognition, an understanding that the game had come to an end. Margaret said nothing. She simply stood there, the shovel still in her hand, watching Thomas with that unreadable expression he had learned to fear. The silence stretched between them, laden with unspoken meanings, veiled threats, secrets about to be exposed. Thomas finally found his voice and murmured something about returning from a walk, about not being able to sleep. Margaret simply nodded slowly, closed the basement door behind her, locking it with her 2 keys, and began to climb the stairs toward the 3rd floor. As she passed Thomas, so close that their shoulders almost touched, he could smell damp earth and something else, something indefinable but deeply unsettling. She continued upstairs without looking back. Thomas remained motionless until he heard her door close on the upper floor. Only then did he run to his room, lock the door, push his chair against it, and sit there in the darkness, waiting for dawn to arrive quickly. Outside, Morrison kept his silent watch, unaware of the tense encounter that had just taken place, and in the basement of the Halstead boarding house, recently covered by the earth that Margaret had so urgently moved, lay secrets that would soon be exposed to the unforgiving light of justice. The night dragged on with torturous slowness, and Thomas didn't close his eyes for a second, hoping that the first light of day would bring with it the resolution of a mystery that had consumed weeks of his life and cost the lives of far more people than he wanted to imagine. Dawn arrived shrouded in thick fog that transformed Pittsburgh into a ghostly landscape. Thomas had spent the night awake, sitting in the chair leaning against the door, listening to every creak of the old house, every footstep in the hallways, every whisper of the wind against the windows, but nothing extraordinary had happened. The boarding house had remained in sepulchral silence until the first lights began to filter through the constant soot. Around 6 in the morning, Thomas heard movement downstairs, footsteps of several people, male voices speaking in low but firm tones. The operation had begun. He cautiously left his room and found the hallway full of official investigators. Morrison was there, directing other men who spread throughout the boarding house with military efficiency. The other guests had been woken and instructed to remain in their rooms while the search was conducted. Thomas saw Vincent being escorted by 2 officers to the living room, where he would be questioned. Ernst and the other workers from the 3rd floor were also taken downstairs, all with expressions of confusion and alarm. Margaret was the last to come down. She was escorted by Morrison personally, her hands discreetly restrained, her expression a mask of controlled indignation. She protested the trespassing on her property, demanded explanations, threatened legal action. But her voice had a tense quality that betrayed the underlying fear. The investigators went straight to the basement. The door was forced open when Margaret refused to hand over the keys, claiming to have lost them. The sound of splintering wood echoed throughout the boarding house, a final and definitive sound that marked the end of something. Thomas watched from the top of the stairs as the men descended with lit flashlights, disappearing into the darkness below. What happened in the next few hours would be remembered for a long time by the residents of the Allegheny district. Investigators began to systematically excavate the basement, starting with the area of packed earth that Thomas had indicated. It wasn't long before they found the chest he had discovered weeks before, but that was only the beginning. As they dug deeper and into other areas, further discoveries came to light. Personal objects buried in different locations, belongings that had clearly belonged to several people. Each discovery was carefully documented, catalogued and removed for later analysis. The house had become a formal investigation scene, with men constantly coming and going. Margaret had been taken away for questioning in a separate location, but before leaving, she had given Thomas a look he would never forget. It wasn't hatred, nor anger, nor even fear. It was something closer to resignation, as if she knew this moment would eventually come, and had mentally prepared herself for it. Vincent found Thomas in the living room after his own interrogation. He was visibly shaken, his face pale, and his usual confidence completely evaporated. He had narrowly escaped a terrible fate, and the realization of this was written in every line of tension on his face. The two men didn't say much to each other. There were no adequate words for what they had experienced, for the horror that had unfolded under the same roof where they slept every night. They simply remained seated, watching the investigators come and go, slowly processing the magnitude of what was being revealed. Morrison eventually came to speak with Thomas, thanking him for his courage in coming forward with the information. Without this tip-off, how many more people might have disappeared before someone finally connected the dots? How many more chests would have been buried in that dark basement? The investigation stretched over days. The guest house was completely emptied, each guest relocated to other accommodations while the work continued. Experts were called in to examine the basement structure, to analyze every inch of that space that had held so many secrets for so long. Thomas found temporary accommodation in a different boarding house on the other side of the river. He didn't want to stay near his old residence. He couldn't bear the thought of walking down that street again. But work at the foundry continued, and he needed to maintain his routine. He needed something normal to cling to while his mind processed everything. Vincent decided to leave Pittsburgh altogether. The business opportunities that had drawn him to the city no longer seemed so appealing after what he had experienced. He thanked Thomas repeatedly before leaving, acknowledging that he owed his life to the Irishman's vigilance and courage. The two men parted with a firm handshake, and the silent recognition of a bond forged in extraordinary circumstances. Ernst and the other workers also scattered throughout the city, seeking new places to live, trying to forget that they had slept all those nights in a basement full of macabre secrets. The Holstead boarding house was sealed off by the authorities, its windows boarded up, its front door locked with chains. The blackened brick building remained there as a silent monument to the horror it had harbored. The full details of the investigation were never made fully public, but rumors spread through the taverns and street corners of the Allegheny district. There was talk of shocking numbers, disturbing discoveries, a pattern of behavior that had gone unnoticed for years. Margaret Halstead had operated her boarding house as a perfect front, hiding her actions behind an appearance of respectability and efficiency. Thomas was called to testify formally about what he had discovered, about the circumstances that led him to investigate, about what he had found in that buried chest. He told his story with a firm voice, although the memories were difficult to relive. Every detail was important, every observation potentially crucial to building a complete case. Margaret was kept in custody while the investigation continued. She refused to speak, maintaining a stubborn silence that frustrated investigators. But the physical evidence spoke for itself. The stained notebook, the buried belongings, the pattern of missing guests, everything built a clear and terrifying narrative. Pittsburgh continued its inexorable march. The foundries worked day and night. New workers arrived on every train. The city expanded and prospered. But in the Allegheny district, the sealed boarding house served as a grim reminder that not all that glitters is gold, that dangers can lurk behind the most respectable facades. Thomas eventually resumed his life, though never in the same way. He moved to a different area of the city, far from the memories associated with that dark brick boarding house. He continued working at the foundry, but now with a different perspective, a heightened awareness that evil can exist in the most unexpected places, dressed in the clothes of normality. Months later, he learned that Margaret Halstead had been tried and convicted. The details were vague, protected by legal issues and the sensitivity of the case, but justice had been served. To the extent that justice could be served in such situations, those who had disappeared would not return, but at least their memories would not be completely erased. Their fates would not remain eternal mysteries. The boarding house was eventually demolished. The authorities decided that the building could not be sold or reused, that it was better to erase it completely from the city's landscape. Thomas watched from afar as the walls began to crumble, as the structure was systematically dismantled brick by brick. It was like watching a dark chapter of history being physically removed, though the memories remained indelible in those who had lived through it. Where the boarding house once stood, a small park eventually grew. Trees were planted, benches installed, a modest green space in the middle of the industrial district. No plaque marked what had been there before, no memorial explained the history of that land. It was as if the city had collectively decided to forget, to bury the past under layers of fresh earth and new vegetation. But Thomas never forgot. How could he? He carried those memories like invisible scars, constant reminders of how close he had been to danger, of how many others were not so lucky to escape. He had survived through vigilance, through instinct, through a combination of courage and caution that had served him well. Years later, when he told his story to people he trusted, Thomas always ended with the same reflection. Pittsburgh was a city of opportunity, a place where people came seeking a better life, but it was also a place where loneliness and anonymity could make someone vulnerable, where predators could operate in the shadows created by the constant smoke from the foundries. The story of the Halstead boarding house became something of an urban legend in the Allegheny district, whispered in taverns late at night, used by mothers to warn their children about the dangers of blindly trusting strangers. The details grew more dramatic with each retelling, but the essential core of the story remained: a seemingly respectable woman who had hidden terrible secrets beneath her roof. Thomas eventually left Pittsburgh. The city had given him work and sustenance, but also memories he preferred to leave behind. He moved west, started over in a place where no one knew his story, where he could be just another worker among thousands, without the weight of the past pressing on his shoulders. But he never forgot the lessons of those tense months in 1891. He never forgot the importance of trusting his instincts, of paying attention to details that others ignore, of having the courage to act when something seems fundamentally wrong. And he never forgot the faces of the men whose belongings he had found in that buried trunk, interrupted lives and silenced stories that deserved to be remembered, even if their names had been lost in the shadows of the Halstead boarding house. Over the years, the history of the Halstead boarding house faded into a hazy memory, one that Pittsburgh would rather not revisit. The small park that had grown up on the demolished foundations of the building became a tranquil place where workers rested during their lunch break, completely oblivious to what that land had witnessed. The city continued its relentless expansion, swallowing the past under layers of progress and modernization. Thomas carried the lessons of those dark months with him wherever he went. Now settled in a smaller town in rural Pennsylvania, he had found relative peace working in a sawmill where the pace was slower and people knew each other better. There was none of the dangerous anonymity of Pittsburgh, no overcrowded boarding houses where strangers disappeared without anyone asking. Occasionally, on quiet nights, he would find himself thinking about those days. He thought about how easy it had been for Margaret to operate for so long without arousing suspicion. The city was so focused on growing, on producing, on prospering, that certain details went unnoticed. Lonely men came and went constantly, and nobody questioned much when someone simply didn't show up anymore. He also thought about Vincent, wondering where the man had ended up, whether he had managed to forget those tense weeks, or whether he too carried the memories like invisible scars. They never kept in touch after Vincent left Pittsburgh, each preferring to leave that chapter firmly in the past. The story had changed Thomas in ways he only understood years later. He had become more observant, more cautious, but also more aware of the fragility of life and how evil could disguise itself as normality. Margaret Halstead didn't seem like a monster at first glance. She was educated, efficient, respectable in the eyes of the community, and perhaps that was the most disturbing lesson of all. Thomas eventually married, started a family, and put down roots in a community where he knew his neighbors by name. He never told his wife the full story, only vaguely mentioning that he had lived through difficult times in Pittsburgh years before. Some memories were too heavy to share. Some experiences left scars that were better carried alone. The Allegheny district continued to exist, its streets still full of workers and cheap boarding houses, but after the Halstead case, there were subtle changes. Authorities began to pay more attention to reports of missing persons, even when it involved transient workers without close family. Boarding house owners were subjected to greater scrutiny. Records needed to be more complete and detailed. The boarding house itself became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder whispered of the dangers that can lurk in ordinary places. But as the years passed, the details became blurred, truth mingled with speculation, and eventually the story became more legend than fact. Pittsburgh preferred to look forward, not back. Thomas now lived a simple and honest life. He worked with his hands, returning home at the end of the day to a hot meal and familiar faces. It was everything he had longed for when he arrived in Pittsburgh years before, seeking opportunities. He had found them, though not in the way he expected. He had learned about courage, about trusting his instincts, about the importance of acting when something seems wrong. And on nights when the memories returned with particular force, Thomas would look at the starry sky over Pennsylvania and think of those men whose belongings he had found buried. They had come seeking a better life, just like him. The difference was simply luck, timing, or perhaps that survival instinct that made him pay attention when something didn't seem right. The story of the Halstead boarding house would eventually fade completely from collective memory, swallowed up by time and inexorable progress. But for Thomas Brennan, it would always remain vivid, a chapter of his life that had shaped who he would become. And although he preferred not to relive those days, he knew they had served a purpose, that his vigilance had saved lives, including his own. Pittsburgh continued its dance with steel and fire, its chimneys painting the sky grey, its foundries working tirelessly. The city that had been the stage for that somber drama moved forward, as cities do, building upon the past, creating new upon the old. And where the Halstead boarding house once stood, trees grew toward the smoky sky, their roots buried deep in soil that held secrets no one cared to remember anymore. Time has a peculiar way of softening even the darkest memories. Thomas lived many years after that winter in Pittsburgh, building a life far removed from the smoke and shadows that had marked his days at the boarding house. He grew old working with his hands, surrounded by people he knew and trusted, never again allowing the anonymity of a big city to completely envelop him. The story he lived through in those months stayed with him, not as a constant nightmare, but as a distant memory that occasionally surfaced on quiet nights. He had learned something valuable in those tense days, that intuition exists for a reason, that paying attention to details can mean the difference between safety and danger, and that courage sometimes manifests itself simply in not ignoring what seems wrong. Pittsburgh continued to grow, its industries thriving, its streets filling with more and more people seeking opportunities. The Allegheny district transformed over time, new buildings replacing the old, new stories erasing the old. The small park where the boarding house once stood became just another green space among many others, with nothing to indicate what had once existed there. Margaret Halstead disappeared from the town's collective consciousness, her name eventually forgotten, except by those few who had lived through those events. The boarding house that had operated so efficiently became just a vague story, told occasionally but without the force of a concrete fact, more like a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust. Thomas never regretted acting when he did. Vincent had left to build his life elsewhere, probably carrying his own reflections on how close he had been to danger. The other guests scattered throughout the city and beyond, each taking with them fragments of a shared experience they preferred to forget. What remained for Thomas was a heightened awareness of human nature, of how evil can disguise itself as normality, of how easy it is to ignore warning signs when we are preoccupied with our own concerns. He lived the rest of his days with this wisdom, applying it not with paranoia, but with a healthy vigilance that served him well. The seasons passed over Pennsylvania, harsh winters giving way to refreshing springs, hot summers preceding golden autumns. Life continued its natural course, as it always does, indifferent to the human dramas that unfold beneath its eternal gaze. And Thomas found peace in accepting that he had done what he needed to do, that he had been courageous when courage was needed. The story of the Halstead guest house eventually dissolved into the mists of time, becoming more myth than memory, more legend than reality. And perhaps it was for the best. Some stories are too heavy to be carried indefinitely by the collective consciousness. It's better to let them rest, buried under layers of time and oblivion. Thomas Brennan lived a long and, as far as possible, peaceful life. When he finally passed away, many years after that dark winter in Pittsburgh, He took with him the memories of those days, memories he never fully shared with anyone. Some experiences are so intense, so profoundly memorable, that they belong only to those who lived them. And so ends this journey through one of the most disturbing stories the streets of Pittsburgh have ever witnessed. A story about vigilance and courage, about the dangers hidden behind respectable facades, about how the instinct for survival can make all the difference. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for joining us on this dark journey. Leave your thoughts in the comments about what you thought of this story. Subscribe to the channel for